The first thing you need to understand is that the question isn't hypothetical. It's a documented biological reality. And the answer might exist inside a single scan of a brain that looks almost identical to your own. If you've ever read a headline about a violent crime and felt a cold disconnect, like the person who did it wasn't operating on the same software as you, you've already sensed the truth. The hardware is the same. But some circuits are dark, some are silent, some are screaming. In 2018, a team at the University of New Mexico put 49 incarcerated men into an fMRI machine. 41 of them had been convicted of homicide. The scans took 90 minutes each. What they found was not evil. It was a pattern of structural deficits, measurable, visible, predictable. And some of those deficits were present in brains that had never committed a crime. This is where the line between you and a killer begins to blur. If that blur unsettles you, it should. It means the border is thinner than we were taught. Subscribe so you don't lose the thread when we pull it further in the next probe. In the comments, drop the one structural deficit from this study that surprised you most. 9% volume loss, 18% in the amygdala. Or the fact that non-criminal brains carried the same signature. The simple version most people hold is that killers are wired differently. That's true, but the wiring is not what you think. It's not a switch marked kill. It's a series of broken dampeners, regions that are supposed to modulate fear, impulse, and emotional feedback. When those regions are underactive or structurally smaller, the brain doesn't become violent. It becomes unbraked. And an unbraked brain placed in the wrong environment drifts toward harm the way a car with no brakes drifts downhill. It's not a choice. It's a physical trajectory. A study published in the Archives of General Psychiatry mapped the brains of 47 violent offenders. They found a 9% reduction in the volume of the temporal lobe, or a region critical for impulse control and emotional regulation. 9% doesn't sound dramatic. But when you consider that the amygdala, the fear processing center, showed an 18% volume reduction in the same group, the picture sharpens. These are not monsters. These are brains missing the architecture that keeps most of us in check. If you've ever felt your heart race during an argument only to talk yourself down seconds later, what you just used is the same brake system that doesn't activate in a nonviolent offender's brain. You didn't choose to calm down. Your prefrontal cortex did. Now consider the forensic data from a man named Robert Hare. In 1991, Hare finalized the psychopathy checklist, a diagnostic tool that measures 20 traits on a 40-point scale. A score of 30 or higher qualifies as psychopathy. The average person scores between 3 and 6. But here's the uncomfortable part. Those traits, superficial charm, grandiosity, a lack of remorse, pathological lying, do not cause violence by themselves. They only predict it when combined with a specific neurological signature. Low autonomic reactivity. The killer's body does not produce the same stress response yours does. Their heart rate stays flat during conflict. Their sweat glands remain dry. They don't feel the physical weight of the act the way you would. If you've ever been in a moment of high pressure and felt your own pulse slow, your palms stay dry, mild, even just for a second, you know what that absence of fear feels like. Now imagine it's the default setting. There's no off switch because the alarm never went on. This is where the data gets harder to ignore. In a landmark study spanning 3 decades, researchers tracked the heart rates of 900 children at age 3, then correlated them with violent crime at age 35. The children with the lowest resting heart rates, below 66 beats per minute, were significantly more likely to commit violent crimes as adults. The mechanism is not mystical. A low heart rate indicates underarousal of the central nervous system. The brain seeks stimulation to compensate. The most efficient source of stimulation is risk. Violence for a brain that cannot feel its own fear becomes a form of self-regulation. It is not a moral choice. It is a biological hunger. If you've ever felt the pull of a dangerous situation, the edge of a cliff, the flicker of road rage, the quiet urge to say something you shouldn't, you know the contours of that impulse. The difference is your system triggers a stop. In the killer's brain, the signal doesn't arrive. The brake cable is missing. The next layer is structural. In 2010, a team at the University of Wisconsin scanned the brains of 200 people, half with a history of violence, half without. They used a technique called diffusion tensor imaging to map the white matter tracts connecting the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala. In the violent group, these tracts were disrupted. The connection was weaker. The prefrontal cortex sends inhibitory signals to the amygdala during emotional arousal. In the killer's brain, those signals degrade before they arrive. It's not that the killer feels more rage, it's that the rage, once triggered, cannot be reversed. Here's what changes everything. The same pattern as and reduced prefrontal amygdala connectivity appears in people with traumatic brain injuries who never commit crimes, in individuals with frontotemporal dementia, in children who grew up in neglectful environments and developed smaller orbitofrontal cortices. The wiring is the same. The outcome depends on the environment, the circumstances, and 1,000 variables that the justice system refuses to count. That refusal is exactly why staying inside this channel matters. We count what the system ignores. Subscribe to keep mapping those variables as we drill deeper into case after case. Tell us in the comments, have you ever known someone whose personality shifted after a head injury? And if so, what changed first? If you've ever known someone who changed completely after a head injury, became irritable, reckless, unrecognizable, you've watched the same circuitry fail in slow motion. It's not a personality change. It's a biological disconnection. The person you knew is still there. But the bridge between their impulse and their restraint is gone. This brings us to the central question. If your brain was wired like a killer's, would you still be you? The answer from the neurological evidence is no. You would not be you, not in any meaningful sense. The self, the continuous narrative self that remembers, plans, and modulates is not a soul, it is an emergent property of these circuits functioning together. When the circuits break, the self reorganizes around the break. The person who emerges from a traumatic brain injury is a new version of the mind, one that exists with diminished capacity to inhibit, to feel fear, to scan for consequences. That person can commit acts that the previous self would have recoiled from. And they would not feel the recoil. The emotional memory of why they shouldn't has been severed. You would still know in a conceptual sense that violence is wrong, but you would not feel it. And without the feeling, the knowledge rests on a shelf. It doesn't drive behavior. The homicide rate in the year 1910 in the United States was 4 per 100,000 people. By 1990, it had risen to 9 per 100,000. In certain urban areas, it hit 40%. The explanation is not that minds became more evil. It's that the environmental conditions, chronic stress, poverty, head trauma, childhood abuse, lead exposure, degraded the biological infrastructure of impulse control across a population scale. Lead alone, which lowers prefrontal function and increases impulsivity, has been directly linked to a 30% increase in violent crime rates in cities with high lead exposure. When the brake cable is worn thin on a million brains, the system breaks. It's not a crime wave. It's a population-scale neurological lesion. If you've ever looked at a headline about a mass shooting and felt that the response was too slow, too confused, too focused on motive, you were right. The system is asking the wrong question. It's asking, why did he choose this? When it should be asking which circuits failed and when did they fail? And can we detect it before the act? The open loop, the one the evidence leaves deliberately open, is this. We have known the neurological markers of violence for at least 2 decades. We have the tools to screen for them. We do not use them. Because to screen for a killer's brain would be to admit that the killer is not an aberration. It would be to admit that the wiring exists on a continuum and that the line between you and the person in the mugshot is not a moral boundary. It is a statistical threshold. That threshold is the hardest fact to sit with and the one that demands the most rigorous follow-through. Subscribe now so you don't miss the moment we break down exactly what a screening protocol could look like and what it would cost us to ignore it. In the comments, write whether you think society should start scanning for these markers even before any crime has been committed. Somewhere on that curve, your brain sits. And if you were pushed one standard deviation in the wrong direction by trauma, by lead, by a single concussion at age 14, the question of whether you would still be you is no longer a philosophical exercise. It is a test of the evidence. And the evidence says you might not know. Because the person who knows is the person who is lost in the transformation. The neural architecture of a single case makes this concrete. In 2012, a 42-year-old man walked into a police station in Albuquerque. He had no history of violence. He was employed, married, and had never been arrested. Over the preceding 6 months, he had developed sudden and uncontrollable sexual urges toward children. He was horrified by them. He confessed to his wife. She helped him find help. The hospital found a tumor in his orbitofrontal cortex, note the exact region that modulates impulse and social behavior. When the tumor was removed, the urges vanished. When it regrew, they returned. The pattern was clean. The behavior was not a choice. It was a physical consequence of compressed neural tissue pressing against the brain's braking system. This is not a story about a single man. It is a map. If a tumor can trigger pedophilic urges in a previously healthy brain, then the boundary between normal and pathological is not a wall. It is a gradient of structural integrity. And the gradient applies to every category of violence the justice system categorizes as evil. The tumor just made the mechanism visible. In most killers, the damage is distributed. A reduction in gray matter here, a weaker white matter tract there, a disrupted autonomic response system everywhere. The effect is the same. The cause is just harder to isolate. The evidence before you tells a single story. There is no such thing as a born killer. There is only a brain that, due to measurable structural and functional deficits, cannot stop itself. And the same deficits exist in milder forms in brains that never offend. The difference is environmental friction. The killer is not a different species. The killer is your brain with the dampeners turned off, placed in circumstances that pressed the accelerator. If you have ever judged a headline with certainty, he was evil, as she was a monster, the evidence asks you to reconsider. The certainty you felt was not justice. It was the comfort of believing the wiring is foreign. It is not.